The Metroid Prime series has never really been a stranger to change. As a spin-off, Prime has always been somewhat defined by how it changed up the original Metroid formula, and the Prime series itself has only continued to change further with each subsequent iteration. If someone wanted to enjoy the original Metroid Prime today, the easiest way to do so would probably be the Metroid Prime trilogy, but that wouldn't be an exact recreation of Prime's original form from back in 2002 on the Nintendo GameCube. No, the trilogy version is an entirely different experience, having been fundamentally changed by the addition of several new features that were cherry-picked from other titles in the series.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Completionist New Game Plus, where I am recompleting the first 120 games I ever featured here on the channel. And today's game happens to be the perfect fit for the isolated, socially distant times that we currently live in. If I gotta be stuck inside by myself, I'm glad I can do it with the lone bounty hunter Samus. My original episode on Metroid Prime was special to me, as it marked one of the first times I had a guest here on the show, and that guest was MatPat from Game Theory.
Yes!
MatPat, are you there? MatPat.
And I'm ready to do it all over again, buddy.
Oh, okay. I guess we can still do collaborations just remotely, despite how moody and isolated Metroid Prime actually is.
Oh, because I don't want to intrude where I'm not wanted. I understand, I can be kind of cringy sometimes. And by kinda, I mean a lot cringy sometimes, so I get if you've moved past me at this point. Even though I will say that when we did that collab years ago, it helped boost your numbers to unforeseen heights and open up the floodgates for super cool guests for years to come. But no, I get it. I'm not wanted here. I'll just go and exist in my lonely theory cave. Sad and alone.
No, let's do it. I swear, let's do it.
You sure?
Yes, I'm totally sure.
Cool.
It's time to recomplete
Metroid Prime.
I admit it, I used to be something of a Metroid purist. A snob, if you will. I knew what I liked, and what I liked was classic Metroid. So, suffice to say, I wasn't that impressed with Metroid Prime when it first hit shelves. Despite how gorgeously gloomy it looked and how smoothly it played, it just wasn't the Metroid that I grew up with. In fact, I probably would have called it overrated, but you have to understand that at the time, I was in the middle of a serious Metroid drought. We all were. It had been 8 years since the release of the previous Metroid title. And it wasn't just any Metroid title. This was Super Metroid, the one that solidified the status of an entire subgenre of video games, and the one that I personally thought of when I heard the name Metroid. Metroid Prime was not Super Metroid, and I kind of held it against it. But then, when I went on to complete Metroid Prime for the show back in 2013, Super Metroid happened to be much fresher in my mind since I had to complete that game only a year prior. You'd think that being able to more accurately compare the two would only make my criticisms of Metroid Prime harsher. But no, playing Metroid Prime so soon after Super Metroid helped me realize just how much of the latter was present in the former. When I was a youngin', all I had to go off of was my inaccurate memory and puffed up nostalgia for Super Metroid, the holy grail, if you will. But when I put the two right next to each other, I saw just how reverently the spirit of classic Metroid was recreated in its first-person cousin. I was able to appreciate that it was the next logical step for the franchise, and now with Prime, Metroid had finally been resurrected. I loved it, and if it wasn't for the ridiculous amount of scanning you had to do in order to do it all, and the lack of equivalent rewards for doing so, it would have definitely earned to complete it for me.
I'm glad you finally got all that off your chest. But now it's 7 years later. 7 years. Wow. So old. Time is so fleeting. Death be not proud. Death lurks over our very shoulders. And there's a new way to play Prime! Nintendo eventually re-released Metroid Prime as well as its two sequels in a bundle known as the Metroid Prime Trilogy, which happens to boast tons of changes both aesthetic and mechanical to the original Prime title. In fact, a lot of those changes first showed up in a version of Prime called New Play Control Metroid Prime, a Japan-only release whose chief purpose was to introduce the Wii's motion controls to Nintendo's flagship FPS series. Made a lot of sense, and its implementation was surprisingly not half bad. So now we've got the Prime Trilogy version complete with motion controls, and a slew of other changes that make this Wii version decidedly different from the GameCube release. Oh, don't you worry, it has still got the same map expanding, upgrade collect and gameplay that you'd expect from a Metroid title, and this version still tells the story of Samus's continuing vendetta against the space pirate forces as she follows them to the mysterious planet Talon 4, but in a lot of ways, with all its tweaks and upgrades, this trilogy version of Metroid Prime may just be the single best way to experience it.
Okay, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room here. No, this game wasn't originally intended to utilize motion controls, but the way those controls were retrofitted into Metroid Prime ended up being well thought out and surprisingly comfortable. Like, if this was your first brush with Metroid Prime, I'd hazard a guess that you'd never suspect that this was a foreign element. It may be a big feature, but that waggle tech is just one of the many features that makes this version of the game completely different and ultimately end up feeling like a strange amalgamation of all of the Metroid Prime history.
Let's be honest, Metroid Prime was always a little weird with how it handled its first-person perspective. Unlike most of its FPS contemporaries, Prime didn't allow players to look around freely while in motion. You had to stop and hold a trigger to aim. Of course, that wasn't really much of a problem thanks to the lock-on system, but it was still super unorthodox. Now, with the motion controls, the lock-on feature is still present, but players can also look around and freely aim their crosshairs with the Wiimote. It's pretty much point and click. It's a virtual recreation of the system that was first introduced in Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. There are definite pros and cons to each of these systems, but you can't go wrong with these motion controls.
Actually, I can. My setup while completing this game had me at my computer desk, which didn't leave me much space between me and my Wii sensor bar. Needless to say, it sometimes made aiming a pain in the ass, but I recognize that those were suboptimal conditions that I chose for myself. But speaking of Metroid Prime 3, that was the latest Prime that I had completed right before this one. So I couldn't help but compare the two time and time again. And several of the criticisms that I had for Corruption seriously put some of the original Prime's more subtle features into perspective. Like the locales, for instance. Corruption's locations were cool enough, but they've got nothing on the variation and allure of the originals. There are no homogeneous gray areas here. Every place feels unique and fascinating, from icy cliffs to hot-ass caves to bugs and stuff. This game possesses several instances of awe and wonder when you leave one area only to arrive somewhere that looks completely different only seconds later.
And if we're talking about awe, we can't neglect to mention this game's soundtrack. I mean, it hasn't changed or anything, but it still has to be brought up. It's still worthy of praise after all these years, perfectly providing appropriate tones, whether you're hunting down pirates or gliding through the water. This is still one of the best video game soundtracks of all time, and it needs to be on at least one of your playlists. And if I can just hop on the comparisons to Metroid Prime 3 bandwagon for a second, it's worth mentioning this first game's superior sense of isolation and dread. The Metroid series, at its heart, has always been about Samus, alone, versus these insurmountable odds in hostile alien territory. And those feelings ended up kind of diluted in Prime 3. And don't get us wrong here, we're not knocking the game or anything, it is excellent too. But I know what I'd prefer if given the choice between a solo Samus adventure or a group outing. Other bounty hunters? Okay, I'm alright with that. A whole army of soldiers to continually interact with throughout the course of the game? Nah. Several different planets to hopscotch between? Just doesn't make sense. I prefer my Metroids quiet, remote, isolated. It's that very sense of quiet that affords players the time to reflect on just how gorgeous this game is, to get lost in its sense of immersion. You're very rarely reminded that you're playing a video game, with most of the narrative coming from the items that you're scanning and the subtle visual clues in the environment. No need for dialogue, no need for excessive cutscenes.
Seeing what a populated Metroid Prime looks like has only made me appreciate this game and its subtle details even more than before. Little touches like Samus's famous reflection, how some of her visors will short out in certain conditions, and how, with the thermal visor equipped, you can see the tip of her blaster black out while charging the freeze beam. It's pretty dope. Some small nuances are conspicuously missing from the trilogy version though, like the way charging certain beams would result in visual effects on Samus's arm cannon. They're missed, but they're certainly not deal breakers. And that's because Metroid Prime still possesses its very best attributes, which are the best parts of any Metroid game. You're still slowly opening up more and more of a sprawling map, you're still buffing yourself along the way with collectibles you find, and you're still bringing down bosses which aren't as much bullet sponges as they are puzzle skill checks. That sense of progression and empowerment that you get from acquiring a new skill is still there. It's what makes Metroid feel like Metroid. Oh, and I love that I'm able to swap between weapons again. It may not sound important, but the ability to choose which beam type you have equipped was sorely missed in Prime 3. Constantly obtaining cumulatively more powerful beams was cool and all, but playing this game again reminded me of just how much I missed the freedom of choice and the challenge of knowing which tool was required for a specific job. Like these guys, I forgot how much I loved these guys. These multicolored space pirates pretty much made weapon switching a requirement, and they're severely underutilized in the rest of the franchise. But I have to admit that there are also some features from later games that I wish were also incorporated into this version of Prime. Specifically, the quality of life changes to the scanning system, which color-coded items to let you know what kind of scannable it was, and if you already scanned it before. In this version, it's much easier to get things confused, and that makes the whole scanning system feel a bit dated by comparison.
Yeah, and that feels extra unfortunate considering that completing this game was, and will always be about scanning stuff. Forget shooting, forget collecting, the vast majority of the Prime completion pie comes down to whipping out that scan visor and going to work. The process can still be a bit nerve-wracking considering the existence of complete missable scans. That being said, we've got a much greater appreciation for scanning and the rest of the purely optional content nowadays. In fact, if we didn't go out of our way for the majority of those energy tanks and lore scans, Metroid Prime would just be way less enjoyable. Taking your time to explore a bit, and yeah, scan everything along the way provides so much to the player. If you refrain from doing your research, you might just miss out on an enemy's weakness or a fascinating bit of narrative insight. Those optional scans are Metroid Prime's best source of satisfying narrative, alongside that story that's being told by the environments themselves. And paying attention to that stuff prevents the game from feeling generic and faceless. That goes double for the actual collectibles, the missiles, the energy tanks. Shoutouts to them for having an immediate effect on your gameplay. Not like those Chozo artifacts though. As far as we can tell, they're just a bunch of completion fodder.
And on the topic of completion, it's effectively the same process as it's always been, up to a point. You still progressively unlock entries in the image gallery, but they're no longer tied to the status of your logbook. Instead, you have to purchase those image galleries with credits. That's right, credits. Yet another mechanic from Metroid Prime 3 that's been rolled into the other titles in the trilogy. As you accomplish feats in the game, you'll earn these credits which can be spent on bonuses at your discretion. But there's a problem, of course. See, you get different kinds of credits for performing specific activities, but certain types of credits are only available in certain games in the trilogy release. Oh, I got tons of orange credits for beating bosses and plenty of silver ones for filling up the logbook, but the purple ones are only available in Prime 2, and the rest of the rainbow can only be found in Corruption. That is, except for the green credits. Now, these goddamn green credits, they're the ones that you would get from a friend voucher on the Wii's online systems. But that service is long gone, and the only way to get those green credits now is to download a save for Metroid Prime Trilogy off of the internet that is completely wiped clean of game saves of all the trilogies, with the exception of the inclusion of a bunch of green credits that are already ready to spend. So that's exactly what I did. I started a fresh new save file with a few green credits in my pocket from the get-go. But then that left all the other credits that I had no access to if I stuck to the first Metroid Prime. After all, the extra store is tied to every game in the trilogy, and several bonuses require credits from all three games. Well, quite simply, I focused solely on the extras that were explicitly tied to the original Prime. Like the original image galleries, which only cost orange credits, the first game's soundtrack, which only required silvers, and interestingly enough, the Metroid Fusion suit. In Prime's original release, this used to be a bonus for linking your GameCube with the Game Boy Advance copy of Metroid Fusion. Now, it just costs a couple of credits. I miss the unlockable copy of the original Metroid that you'd get from the same setup, but what are you gonna do?
This whole credit system is a huge departure from what Prime's original completion process felt like. I get what they're trying to do by integrating all the games and their unlockables together, but it only makes the job harder and more ambiguous. I understand that completionists are a niche audience, but come on guys, this is annoying.
Thank goodness I had a little guidance while I was completing this game. I was streaming the entire completion process when a few genuine Metroid Prime speedrunners showed up and filled me in on how to break certain sequences early and obtain items way earlier than intended. It was a ton of fun. Like unlocking the power bomb super early in a really bizarre way, or morphing into a ball at just the right time to be hit by an enemy into an otherwise unreachable area, which leads to the plasma beam way ahead of schedule. Yay! These tricks took me a while to get down, and ultimately, I didn't really need to do them since I was gonna have to get everything anyways. But these sequence breaks helped me make my playthroughs feel a little different from one another. And when you're beating this game so many times in a row on a live stream, that variety really helps. Oh my god. Now what? What the f is happening? Now you want to lay a bomb.
Completing Metroid Prime took Gerard 3 separate playthroughs. The names of the difficulties may have been changed since back in the day, but they basically shake out to easy, normal, and hard mode. He started out on normal, and then once that mode was beaten, moved up to hard, then finally back to easy because let's face it, completion ain't easy. And sometimes it's just nice to coast into the finish line. And if I know Gerard, he made sure to obtain the 3 appropriate amounts of logbook completion in order to nab all 3 different endings. Why? Because that is why he's the completionist, my friends.
And ultimately, completing Metroid Prime was about the same as it ever was, which is to say, a great time. And I'm happy to say that I have more of an appreciation for it now than I ever have before. It's truly impressive when a game seems to get better and better over time, even if it's been tweaked a little bit.
Now let's see if they improve it even further when the trilogy is released on the Switch, cause you know it's coming! But why would Gerard play through it again? Let's face it, because he's the completionist. Man, these completion bonuses haven't aged a day. You still got yourself all 3 different endings, depending on how much you filled out your logbook. There's Samus posing on her ship, Samus posing on her ship without her helmet, and of course, the Metroid Prime 2 teaser for full completion. And as stated earlier, the galleries are still here too, even if they have to be unlocked slightly differently. So all of the stuff that made Metroid Prime the way it was is still here, including the back-breaking burden of having to scan everything in the galaxy.
Because I took the time to go the distance, I reinforced my appreciation for Metroid Prime and its place in the Metroid library. Playing through it again felt fresher than expected thanks to some of the new ways to play, from both the trilogy itself and a group of cool, awesome guys who are way better at this game than I am. When I recompleted Metroid Prime, there were
26 credits earned. Getting them isn't the hard part. That would be convincing yourself to download those green credits.
12 deaths. Now these deaths were exclusive to hard mode, but at this point, I'm a veteran bounty hunter.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items scanned. I hope all you completionists like a side of Metroid with your main course of scanning.
Over 250 collectibles found across all 3 playthroughs. Yeah, it's a lot, but they're what makes this game worth playing in the first place. 30.5 hours of total playtime, and no more green credits. The last green credit is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Metroid Prime is just as great as it's always been, and in many ways, it's even better than ever.
Admittedly, there's a lot that you have to keep track of and hunt down, but if you go out of your way to do so, it actually reveals a lot of this game's best features.
That being said, the lack of substantial rewards still keeps me from recommending full completion going in. So, with that in mind, guys, we still give this game our completionist rating of Finish It.
Finish it!
A big thank you to MatPat for being our special guest today. Much love to him. If you want to check out his channel, there's a link to that right there on screen. Thank you for watching.